How can we demonstrate a biblical response to abuse? That's the topic that we're going to address today on Flourish-Meant. I'm your host, Tina Yeager. Today, I am privileged to have a wonderful person on a much needed topic today. Her name is Stacey Womack. She is the founder and executive director of ARMS, which is the Abuse Recovery Ministry Services. In her 26 years of working with people, with abuse recovery victims, with churches on the topic of domestic violence and abuse recovery, she was able to develop a brand new book, which is called On the Front Lines of Abuse: Strategies for the Faith Community. Welcome, Stacey. I'm so glad that you're here to address this topic so that churches, church leaders, and community members and believers know how they can respond to abuse in the community around them.
Thank you. I really appreciate getting the opportunity to be here today.
So, Stacey, can you start with what domestic violence means? It's not just physical, I know that, but not everyone listening may be aware that there are multiple kinds of domestic violence. So could you define those for us?
Absolutely. The root word of violence is to violate. So you can violate somebody with your words, with your actions, with the Bible, with finances, with property, animals. I mean, we have 8 different categories. So verbal, psychological, physical, financial, sexual, property, and spiritual are the categories that we talk about within our programs.
So, Stacey, how will someone know that there's domestic violence going on in the households that are around them, in their church communities, at their workplace, their children's friends, mothers, and households? They may not be aware because a lot of times it's hidden, isn't it?
It is very hidden, and we aren't really socialized to, especially within the faith community, to ever talk about these kinds of things. And also because so many people have such a narrow view, like you mentioned, people get the physical violence, but don't understand the other forms of abuse. So even for those who are experiencing abuse, oftentimes they know something's wrong and they try to go to counseling for help, but it's not necessarily helpful because most people aren't trained in domestic violence. So they themselves are not calling it abuse. They just know something's wrong. And abuse is really about power and control. So it's not about like just having disagreements, communication problems, although that's often what people say when they go to counseling. It is more than that. It is about one person who's using a pattern of behaviors to gain control and power over another person and what they do, what they think, what they say. So in every area of their lives. And it's not just one time, it's ongoing.
And the strange thing is, you might look at the victim and see a pattern of behavior that shows that they're irritable, that they're defensive, that they're guarded, and they might not look like a victim, whereas the perpetrator might appear very charming, very magnetic in their personality. They're incredibly persuasive and influential. Can you talk about how to see past the surface to recognize when someone is being victimized?
I think this is a tricky question because, like you said, most abusers are not what some people think, that they're just the down and outers, drug addicts, things like that. It's actually an equal opportunity offender. So since these guys are so good in public and do what we call public image management, they appear to be perfect on the surface. So it would be really, really hard for someone to recognize that. It would be little clues that they would pick up here and there, like the way they talk about their partner, their spouse. I had a woman in my own church who, now looking back, I didn't know it at the time, but now looking back and realizing that her husband, she could never go to a women's Bible study or a women's retreat because he refused to watch the kids. There's something wrong with that, because God has called men to love their wives like Christ loved the church, and he laid his life down for the church. And so laying your life down isn't something a lot of men have been really taught. What does that look like in everyday life? So helping people to recognize it in the men might be harder than helping them to recognize it in the women. They've lost their sense of confidence. They're lost their ability to feel like they can make good decisions. But even that, I mean, I don't think it's like you can look at somebody and say, oh, they're being abused. because they're sitting in your churches and they're involved and they're involved in, all kinds of ministries in your church. I had to keep telling myself to stop being surprised when yet another woman came to me in my own church and said, I'm in an abusive relationship. So I think that the first thing we need to do for these women who know that something's wrong and are trying to figure out what it is and have libraries of self-help books on how to be a better wife, but it hasn't worked, to educate them about what abuse looks like. So all those different forms of abuse, we could spend more than an hour just going through examples of that to help them understand some of those things that they might be experiencing. And a lot of women who come to us into our Her Journey class, which is our victim recovery class, it's free. And they come thinking, oh, well, I don't know that this is really for me. He's never hit me. And then we go through the types of abuse and they're like, oh my gosh, I've experienced everything that they've listed in there. And it's very disheartening, but at the same time, very eye-opening. And it's the beginning of their journey towards healing.
That's so needed. And I'm so glad that you brought up that believers are experiencing this. This isn't just something that you see outside of the church. In fact, when you think about the typical abuser, which is not someone that is circumstantially led toward abuse through, like you said, an addiction or post-traumatic stress, where it's something that can be healed, it's a personality disorder. It's someone that's characterologically bent on making himself the center of his universe so that he is going to put everyone else beneath him and have that power and control addiction that can become very dangerous. If it hasn't been physically violent, when the woman chooses to end that relationship or get free, that's when it can change, right?
Yeah, actually leaving is the most dangerous time for a victim because he's just lost control. So even if he hasn't been physically abusive, women's risk of fatal injury goes up 1,100%. So we tell the women, we take them through safety planning, or their local domestic violence agency can take them through safety planning. But we can work with them before they're homeless, which is great. So we can begin to help them seek what God is calling them to do in some direction in this. And, we work with the men who are abusive themselves and women who are abusive as well. So we have this really full uh, understanding of abuse and are trained in it and are state approved in a state that's very liberal, and we are very overtly Christian in our approach, but we do understand it. And actually, a lot of our men have experienced abuse in their childhood, and this is just the tool they have used to try to manage life. Doesn't make it okay, doesn't solve it. So, so it's been really interesting to work with all different sides of this, especially myself as having not have experienced abuse personally, and yet God called me into this ministry to get that fuller view of all the different layers and levels and the spectrum of from victim to primary aggressor.
You're saying that you are working with the men who are the perpetrators of abuse to help them reform. Now, in my experience, there have been a lot of men who are perpetrators of abuse who have narcissistic personality disorder. It's not just a post-traumatic stress or a childhood trauma issue that can be healed. It's something that is very resistant to change. They'll pretend that they've changed and they'll woo that victim back in. So how do you guard against putting that victim back at risk again by believing that this abuser is actually reformed when may not be?
Well, and we don't. We always tell the women of the men that we're working with that they're going to be the best judge of whether or not he's changed. He might tell us everything we want to hear, but he can still be going home and being horrible. And abuse plays out in a cycle. So helping her to recognize that cycle well and to follow it. And we tell our clients, both our men and our women, that if all you do is change behavior, you're just pulling the top off of a weed. You're not really addressing the root issue. And so, like you said, Tina, there's a lot of different root issues behind this. Why people use abuse, why people find themselves in abusive relationships. I believe that God makes a difference. We have a lot of men who make some good change, but not enough to save the relationship. We have some guys who make very little change, and we have a few guys who work really, really hard and a long time to work on change. And even after that, even when they reconcile, this is an ongoing process. It's not a year-long process or 2-year-long process. It's a lifelong process. Relationships are hard no matter what. So when you add this to it, it can be, really complicated and really tricky. So we want the women, and we work with them. Our goal isn't for reconciliation, although we believe in reconciliation, but to really work with the individuals as individuals to help them walk alongside them in their own personal journey of recovery, or for the men for a transformation. So, we tell them, keep your focus on God, not on the other person, because you need to do what God is calling you to do, not what I'm telling you to do, not what anybody else is telling you to do, but what is God calling you to do? Because God, he knows what's best for us, and God would never sacrifice a person for the sake of a relationship ever.
Oh, I love that. Can you say that one more time? Because I think
Yes.
that is so important for everyone to understand.
Yeah, so God would never sacrifice a person for the sake of the relationship. Unfortunately, though, the church has been known to do this often, and just because of their lack of knowledge and training around this. I don't think it's because they're unkind. I also think it's a lot of fear around divorce, which is often seen as the worst sin out there. And so when we do our pastoral trainings, we'll go, so we had a woman come to her pastor and say, hey, pastor, can God forgive murder? And pastor thinks for a while, thinks of King David and thinks, well, yeah, I think God can forgive murder. So she goes, so would it be better to murder my husband than divorce him? Because there's this idea that divorce is the worst thing. And of course, it's not what God intended. And if there's opportunity for reconciliation, of course we want that. But God even gave Israel her certificate of divorce. There comes a point where you have to draw some boundaries that are there to keep you and your children safe. And it's not an ungodly thing to do. In the Bible, it says that the prudent man sees danger and hides. So for a woman in abusive relationships, sometimes hiding is the prudent thing to do. It is the wise thing to do.
And it's an opportunity for that other person to be responsible for their behavior. Whereas in that relationship, they defer all their responsibility to the victim. And I noticed that you're also using that typical language that we tend to use because of the statistics that the man is the abuser and the woman is the victim. That isn't always the case, but it is predominantly the case, correct?
Predominantly, and there's a lot of numbers out there. The statistic we use is 76% of domestic violence victims are female. But I can tell you this, having worked with men and women, is that female and male victims say the same kinds of things. Primary aggressors, whether male or female, say and do the same kinds of things. Secondary aggressors that kind of fit in the middle there also say and do very similar things. So it's really interesting, that dynamic of how they act and behave is so similar that they can write books about it. That's why women can read books about domestic violence and go, oh my gosh, this is my life. How are they in my house to know this?
And when we're looking at emotional abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, even spiritual abuse, that victim has a hard time identifying themselves as a victim of abuse. So, can you give us just a couple of things that a victim might need to look at in order to recognize the need to get some emotional safety? Because they're worthy of protection in their hearts, their minds, and their souls as well.
I think that most people don't want to be called a victim. And I know that's why the domestic violence community has moved to survivor. But at some point in the relationship, when you're experiencing abuse, you are a victim. And I think that in our women's recovery group called Her Journey, again, it's a free program that we offer nationally. That program in there, we're really helping them to see their value and to begin it's not enough to know that God loves you and you have value, but you need to believe it with your heart. So we're moving them from head knowledge to heart knowledge about this and how to set appropriate boundaries and why it's not ungodly or unkind or unsubmissive to do this, so that they can begin seeking God for what kind of boundaries they need to set in their own relationship, because it is a journey, and everybody's in their own process and everybody takes their own time and space to do this. So we're just here to kind of walk alongside them as they figure this out, but we are encouraging them to see that God created them with value. So it is appropriate and right to set boundaries because you are valuable.
I want to get into some more specifics about that, but for now, at this point in our conversation, I want you to have an opportunity to share with church leaders, believers, and potential survivors how to get in touch with you and all the wonderful resources that you have to offer, including your new book.
Absolutely. So we have a website, has a lot of information on it called abuserecovery.org. And again, that's abuserecovery.org. Or you can call us at 503-846-9284. And the book, On the Front Lines of Abuse, Strategies for the Faith Community, can be found on Amazon.com and multiple other electronic platforms as well.
Thank you, Stacey. I hope that all of you listening will access these resources and get them to the leaders in your church community, your workplaces, and elsewhere. And of course, I also hope that you will come back for the next episode of Flourish-Meant.